Ladies and gentlemen, is this the DA's first win in the GNU? You can let me know when we go through the video. But before we do, can I yet again remind you, if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon, join the channel, and help me spread the word of the work that I do here. So what's actually gone on? Well, the Higher Education Minister has been fired by Cyril Ramaphosa after intense political pressure. This comes after her dismissal followed accusation of lying to Parliament, with the claims made whether she misled the public over the appointment of ANC-aligned individuals to the SETA board appointments. That's the SETA, Education and Training Authorities Board. Now, whistleblower evidence alleged corruption and tender fraud in the SETA boards, which oversees 20 billion rands worth of budget. Now, she falsely claimed that an independent panel approved the board appointments. Now, the individuals that she named denied any involvement. And during a meeting where she was asked how this was all picked, these individuals were picked, she said, Google it. That's how you determine credibility. I did some videos on this. Now, Parliament summoned her to explain what had gone on, and she missed to the meeting. She just couldn't be bothered to do it. And she issued rather weak excuses, and this further angered, well, the MPs in Parliament, because they said she thought she was unaccountable. And by all intents and purposes, she did think she was unaccountable. Now, Ramaphosa initially resisted firing her, and you've got to understand why he resisted firing her. And it was ultimately due to sensitive internal ANC dynamics, specifically in KZN. He feared that there'd be backlash if he targeted an ANC politician after recently suspending the police minister, also from KZN. He feared that some of the KZN ANC would, well, oust him because they'd be angry. Now, other senior ANC members like Gwede and Zulu, they all defended her, citing family loyalty to the party. Yep, I'm not actually sure how loyalty and family to the party has got to do with her performance, but hey, I don't work in these circles. In any case, despite widespread anger, some ANC insiders argued that firing her would send the wrong message. So as you can see, some of them were defending her because of loyalty to the party. Others didn't want to fire her because of maybe KZN would collapse and asked Ramaphosa. Obviously, you know that KZN is fragile anyway because of Jacob Zuma. Jacob Zuma obviously being from KZN. And ultimately, others were just like, nah, you can't fire her because maybe the DA looks like they won this one. I don't know. I don't make the rules here. In any case, the DA threatened to block the appropriation bill, that's the budget legislation, unless this minister was fired. And her axing has now unlocked the DA's support for the budget, which will avoid a legislative crisis. Now, the DA's leader, John Steenhuisen, declared the firing a step in the right direction, but emphasized that firing her doesn't mean that the ANC has now just renewed itself. In fact, the DA has now laid criminal charges against her. So, who's been appointed as the new Minister of Education? Well, this was a former deputy minister who's now been promoted to Minister of Higher Education. I mean, it's nice to kind of see promotion from a deputy to a minister, because this hasn't happened in the police ministries, where they got rid of a police minister and then got an outsider to take the job. It's very weird. In any case, this individual, a Booty, is a very interesting choice. Now, the reason that he's very interesting is because he has long-standing experience in the ANC. In fact, he actually served in the ANC under Jacob Zuma. And would you know it, he has an ideological problem, and that he's been very vocal about anti-Israel advocacy. In fact, he once glorified Israeli Apartheid Week. Yep, that's actually a thing, apparently, Israeli Apartheid Week. Now, the reason that he's been appointed is, I don't know. But what we do know is that a former KZN Premier has been appointed as the deputy. So he's gone up, the former KZN Premier has gone in as a deputy. And would you know it, that individual, they're squeaky keen. In fact, they were actually one of the original ANC-linked appointees to the SETA board, creating a circular rotation of power and prestige. So what we've seen is that this minister has been fired due to trying to appoint ANC loyalists to the SETA board. We've then got a previous guy who was a deputy minister who served under Zuma and just hates Israel. he's taking the minister's role, and one of the original ANC-linked appointees to the board is now gone in as deputy. And this apparently is all just like accountability or something. I don't know what to tell you. Like, this is just ANC. And the problem is the ANC just has no one clean left. They just recycle the same retards over and over again. Now, in typical fashion, many individuals have commented on the palaver. Some academics have suggested that the minister's removal was long overdue. And others argued that apparently she had lost the trust of the education sector, specifically because, well, she lied. Now, Razan Zanzi, Action SA, and even the MK party slammed her for her political arrogance and disregard for accountability. So what we could take from all of this is, yeah, she wasn't exactly very well liked, but the ANC doesn't care about how well liked they are. The problem is the ANC wants to understand, go back to what I said already, party loyalty. And apparently she was very loyal to the party, which meant she was fine. Now, underneath her regime, student debt and funding has become rather a crisis at the NSFAS. And the use of the SETA boards as political patronage networks, well, were becoming very, very problematic because, in typical fashion, it's not even done in a covert way. So ultimately, what we can actually see here is that the minister themselves just really wasn't very good at her job. It wasn't just that she wasn't well liked, she was not very good at her job. Again, another problem that Ramaphosa seems to have a lot. In any case, Ramaphosa's reluctance to act swiftly exposed complete double standards in terms of cabinet discipline and a pattern of inaction, selective accountability, and fear of political fallout. Again, something we're seeing now quite a lot with Ramaphosa. Now, he refused to address the press or the nation directly. He hid behind spokespersons, and his inaction ultimately has led to suspicions of forms of political leadership paralysis, prioritizing coalition politics over constitutional accountability. Now, the ANC just loves to protect them loyalists rather than actually upholding governance standards. And then they do sit there wondering why nobody trusts them anymore and why faith in democracy in this country has just gone to absolute horse rubbish. Now, it's important to recognize that this individual has not been fired because of integrity. That's really important to understand. So whilst the ANC is like, yes, we care about accountability, and whilst the DA is like, yes, this is a good win for us, it's important to recognize that ultimately this individual's firing is about buying budget votes. It reveals a fragile GNU. It shows that there's deep factionalism within the ANC, and ongoing corruption and cadre deployment will continue, only unless it impacts the budget votes, because as we all know, the ANC has already looked like a tit a number of times with failures on budget votes, and they just don't want to see another one. Now, some individuals have suggested that this is just the tip of the iceberg, and there are calls for action against Human Settlements Minister Gwede Mantashe and other state capture aligned individuals, but let's be honest, it's not going to happen unless it's politically expedient to do so. Because one thing that we can take from Sir Ramaphosa so far is that there is no reform agenda. There's only political movements and political maneuvering in order to gain favours. And this, unfortunately, is exactly why South Africa at the moment is just a failed state, because we never prioritise the country over the party. So moving then on to a final news story, and this is the news story that, to be frank, you'd be forgiven for not knowing about. And that's because the news story isn't really considered to be that important. But this is the news story of a Patrick Soon Singong, a South African-born Chinese ethnic individual. Now, this individual is moving to Los Angeles in America in order to take over the Los Angeles Times. He's going to take the newspaper public within the next year. And he made this announcement on the Jon Stewart show on The Daily Show. So that in itself isn't really that important, a billionaire moving to the US. Well, why is it that I say this news is actually a hell of a lot more important than you would think? Well, because in January 2022, Patrick and President Ramaphosa officially launched a vaccine manufacturing facility in Brackenfell, Cape Town, and the purpose was to produce COVID-19 vaccines, as well as cancer, TB, and HIV vaccines from start to finish. It wasn't just a full and finish. Now, the target capacity was 1 billion doses annually by 2025. Now, the actual investment into this actually came from NantWorks, who invested approximately $200 million into the project, and then generous scholarships were applied, of $6.5 million, which were pledged to train between 400 and 600 local staff. A second plant was also then created in Kabaka, also known as Port Elizabeth, but this was an existing Aspen pharmaceutical facility which was meant to do fill and finish. Now, the role of full and finish was to assemble Johnson & Johnson COVID-19 vaccines into vials and packaging them for domestic and African-wide distribution. The capacity was meant to be producing around 220 million doses per year. Now, this represents a complementary but different stage of vaccine manufacturing or production compared to the Cape Town facilities. So you may look at these two plants and say, well, there's a Cape Town facility and there's a Kabaka-based facility, and basically in Aspen. Now, both of these did seem to get government funding. In fact, they were all part of the industrialization of South Africa. The whole idea meant to be that we have these pharmaceuticals that would provide pharmaceutical care up and down Africa. But the Cape Town facility hasn't produced vaccine doses to date. Apparently, according to the news, is still in regulatory pilot or early stage ramp up. So basically, it's been sat there, well, doing nothing, despite these huge big investments. Now, official statements hoped for the first vaccines within 6 to 8 months, but remember, that was like ages ago. But as of mid-2025, there hasn't been an announced vaccine output from, well, this plant. Now, the Gqeberha manufacturing plant has successfully filled and packaged hundreds of millions of COVID-19 vaccine doses, but it did not produce the vaccine substance itself. So it's just a repackaging plant, if you want to call it that. Now, under a Johnson & Johnson licensing deal, this Aspen plant has filled and produced COVID-19 vaccines and had produced over 120 million doses by late 2021. But by 2022, the output was over 225 million doses, mainly being sent out to Africa. However, there's been many issues from that plant, such as FDA warnings, which occurred in early 2025. Now, this hasn't actually halted production, though it does signal regulatory hurdles. So what exactly are those regulatory hurdles? Well, despite the plant being made to have strong sterile capabilities, it has dropped the Johnson & Johnson fill-to-finish line to explore other uses of the plant now that, well, COVID vaccines aren't really that high in demand anymore. And the demand for the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, as you can imagine, has, well, decreased. So what is the actual future of that plant? Well, the answer is no one knows, because what else can it be used for? Well, don't know. And it's all really important, as the brainchild of this, the person who potentially benefited from government subsidies for this, is now looking to leave and go to the US. Many such situations of these self-enriched individuals who tend to just leave and leave behind manufacturing capabilities that do nothing despite millions being invested from the government coffers. Anyway, just my views. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. Until tomorrow, bye.